Hi everyone, my name is Paige, and as part of the Pacific Salmon Awareness Project with my partner Jen, we're going to be discussing Pacific salmon in northern Canada. So our topic for week 1 is all introductory information about Pacific salmon. So that's going to consist of the life history and distribution of Pacific salmon in Canada. So let's get started. So firstly, when we are discussing Pacific salmon, we're referring to a group of 5 species of salmon. As you'll notice, they're all from the genus Oncorhynchus. So first up, we have Oncorhynchus shawchitsa, which is Chinook salmon, Oncorhynchus kita, which are chum salmon, Oncorhynchus kisuch, which are coho salmon, Oncorhynchus gorbutia, which are pink salmon, and then also Oncorhynchus nerka. And you can see all of them over on the right here. They all look slightly different. And we'll get into the morphology later on when it comes to detection. So an overview of the species, generally Pacific salmon are all in the same realm when it comes to life history. They all have pretty similar traits, but there are some unique traits to each of them. So first up for our Chinook salmon, they are the largest species of Pacific salmon. They weigh in at 126 pounds, so they're quite large fish. They're also spring salmon who enter rivers earlier than the other salmon, and they're piscivorous, meaning they eat smaller fish. In terms of their range, they're found in a few streams within British Columbia and the Yukon. For chum salmon, these are the poor jumpers of the Pacific salmon groups, so when it comes to rivers that are harder to maneuver or even waterfalls, chum are generally limited in their migration, whereas the rest of the salmon might not have as much of an issue dispersing themselves. They're also an important food source in coastal communities. In terms of their distribution, they're found in quite a few streams throughout British Columbia and the Yukon. Coho salmon they have the most distinct populations in British Columbia. So while pink salmon are the most abundant, as you'll see on the right there, the populations of coho are the most distinct, so they're easiest to see when it comes to population size. They also remain closer to the coastline and don't go out as far into the ocean as other salmon, and they inhabit smaller streams, generally smaller streams and ponds. They can be found in bigger lakes and streams, but it's uncommon. And then their range is coastal streams within British Columbia. And then we have the pink salmon, which, as I mentioned, are the most abundant. And they also have a relatively short lifespan of 2 years, whereas the other ones can get up to 4 or even 6 years old. Their range is in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, which we'll be talking about extensively. They're actually found in the Mackenzie River system within the Northwest Territories. And lastly, we have sockeye salmon. Sockeye salmon feed on shrimp and crustaceans, and they also experience cyclic dominance, which essentially means that certain brood years tend to become more distinct and more dominant throughout the populations and will end up breeding. And typically that ends up being the 4th year brood year. And they're not really sure why that happens. There's still a lot of research going into it, but that is unique to the sockeye salmon. Lastly, the range of sockeye salmon is British Columbia as well as the Yukon. So this is just a general overview of the life history of Pacific salmon. It essentially consists of freshwater spawning and growth, which is usually about a year. Then they migrate out to the oceans and stay there for anywhere from a year to 4 years. And then they return to the rivers where they spawn and die, and then the cycle starts over again.
Hi everyone, it's Jen here now. We will be talking about the natural distribution of Pacific salmon. In the North Pacific, their maturation and feeding range extends from the Bering Sea down to Japan and across to California, as you can see from the blue-colored area all along the coast on both sides. They like to inhabit the entire area. They inhabit the entire area within these boundaries from 1 to 4 years, while they eat and grow until they reach reproductive maturity, as Paige briefly mentioned in the previous slide. In recent decades, they have been increasingly present in the Beaufort Delta Sea during this phase of life. As a result of rising global temperatures and the fact that the Arctic is warming at a faster rate than the rest of the world, the natural range of suitable habitat for Pacific salmon is expanding northward. This gives them the opportunity to migrate down new tributary systems. Prior to 1981, there were no reports of salmon in the Mackenzie River. Once the Pacific salmon mature, They will make the journey up coastal freshwater tributaries to their spawning grounds, where they will mate and die shortly thereafter. This phase of the life cycle happens in the fall. In Canada, along the west coast, there are many rivers they swim up to spawn. The ones seen here are just the major ones identified on salmonatlas.com, but they are present in 1,300 to 1,500 streams and rivers in BC. I just assume those ones are like really small. They are also present along the coast of Alaska, but we are only concerned with salmon in Canada during this presentation. In 1956, 21,000 pink salmon were introduced to Lake Superior through a Thunder Bay tributary, and it was successfully established throughout the Great Lakes over the decades. In 1966, coho salmon were successfully introduced to Lake Michigan, and they spread as well, and both species have become an important part of sport fishery in the area. I have not found any information on their spread outside of the Great Lakes as of this presentation, but it might be important to note that in this area, coho and pink salmon compete with over 100 other fish in this area, natural and introduced. This may or may not give us an indication on the potential invasiveness of this species in Canadian waters. And so in this slide, I just included a picture of a guy who caught pink salmon more recently in Lake Superior last fall. And then on the left side is just like the area within Canada. You can see they're not really anywhere else except for the Great Lakes where they were introduced and all along the west coast. So yeah, thanks guys.